Hi everyone, Dr. Samantha Cottrera here for the Imagining a New We video blog, a video series designed to help history teachers and other history educators teach history in ways that are more meaningful, transformative, and inclusive for their students. And a key element of meaningful, inclusive, and transformative history education is to be able to look at evidence of the past in ways that are transformative, inclusive, and meaningful. And what that often means is not just bringing in evidence from the past in this add and stir way, but to be able to use evidence of the past to challenge these kind of traditional, like grand narrative myth histories that we often wind up getting ourselves into because they are just like the easy, big narratives of the nation. And so this series, Source Saturday, a lot of S's, is a series designed to help us talk about these things. So one of the ideas of this series is to connect with historians and creators about primary sources, archival sources, oral histories, but even secondary sources that are like interpretive creations, in order to be able to think about some complexities of history and to be able to think about ways that we can bring in some of these sources in ways that challenge our traditional understanding of historical periods. And it's been a wonderful series. I'm just so excited every time I talk to someone, and today's no exception because I already got to meet the person I spoke to before, and we had this really great conversation. And I know this is going to be a wonderful, wonderful conversation. We're talking with Dan Horner. Dan Horner actually works in the criminology department at Ryerson University. He's a historian that has looked at 19th century protests and activism in Montreal. But one of the things that we are going to talk about are 19th century newspapers and things that we can look at from those newspapers to help us challenge our understandings of a particular time period. Are there elements of a newspaper that we're not really really giving full weight to? And one of the things that I've really learned from this series is we often, and like I'm putting myself in this category, we often look at sources really quickly, and so we don't give full weight to some of the meanings behind the things that we can find in this evidence from the past. So it's so exciting to be able to go through a newspaper with him, to be able to bring some of this conversation to your classrooms. So let's go over to Zoom and say hi to Dan. Dan, it's so wonderful to talk with you. Thank you so much for agreeing to be a part of this Source Saturday series. Before we begin, can you introduce yourself?
Sure. It's great to be here. So I'm Dan Horner. I am an associate professor in the Department of Criminology at Ryerson, but my training academically is as a historian. I'm an historian of mid-19th century Montreal, and my work looks at things around politics and popular culture and migration in the city during that period. And I wrote a book called Taking to the Streets: Crowds, Politics, and crowds. I should know this. Crowds, Politics, and the Urban Experience in Mid-19th Century Montreal. Yeah. So I've relied heavily on newspapers to do this work. So I'm looking forward to talking about them today.
And I think when I got in touch with you initially, I wanted to talk a little bit about the activism in Montreal. But then when we connected before, we were talking about how valuable newspapers are kind of as a source. So I'm really excited that we're kind of like going to something a little bit broader in this conversation.
Yeah, so I mean, newspapers are fascinating, and I agree. It's really helpful, I think, to look at them in this broader sort of way, right? Newspapers are sort of the workhorse of. I mean, so many historians rely quite heavily on newspapers, but we don't really talk about them very much. And of course, the way we use newspapers has changed enormously in the past 10 years or so because so many have been digitized. A lot of them are now searchable online, and so that's changed the way that people look at them in the sense that they can sort of based on whatever their project is, they can sort of put in these keywords and get all the references. Although there's problems with that, as Ian Milligan has pointed out in a great piece that was published a few years ago. Search engines don't always work the way that we expect them to work, and all this technology. But I think there's an enormous amount to be gained by just flipping through a newspaper, and that's kind of what I want to talk about today. I think you learn a lot about a community by looking at a newspaper and looking what's being printed there, and also, and I'll hope to talk about this today as well, like thinking about the silences, like what's not there, and kind of reading in between the lines, because I think you also learn about a lot about sort of power and stuff like that in a society by thinking about what's missing.
It's funny because when you said we use newspapers differently in the last 10 years or so, what I thought you were going to say after that was because we don't really read newspapers anymore.
Yeah, right.
And I think that's a really interesting element to this conversation, because you and I are not that old, but we also remember picking up a newspaper on campus in undergrad. And it's important to remember that is not a common experience for many of our students anymore. And
absolutely. And I run into this all the time because I talk about this with my students, and I talk about how, in the late 1990s, my roommates and I in university, we had the newspaper delivered to our house, and, most mornings were spent, we were all sort of flipping through the newspaper, and that was but that's become such a rare, and when I talk about this with students now, they'll say things that make me feel old, like, oh, my grandparents do that, and stuff like that.
You're like, I'm not as old as your grandparents.
I know, yeah.
But I think even just the act of thinking of newspapers. And so when we're talking about the 19th century, just because I come from a K-12 background, I think of students usually in grade 7, 8, or 9. And so students between 12 and 14, they're even more removed than an undergrad student. And so just the act of thinking about how you get your news, I think is such an important thing that we have to ensure that we don't overlook. That is also the history, right? It's not just this is a source, but this is how key this source was for this time period, because we are far more detached from that than we were 10 years ago.
Yeah. And I think it's really important to point out the way that we're detached. But one kind of hook that I've found with students that is interesting is that I make the argument that in fact, despite the fact that newspapers seem increasingly kind of archaic, in fact, once you actually start looking at what's in here and how it's presented to people, it actually kind of resembles, it is like 19th century social media. And you can sort of picture yourself kind of scrolling through this, because the newspapers of the 19th century are actually different than those of the 20th and 21st century. They're a lot more partisan. They're oftentimes sort of devoted to, a single political party and stuff like that. So you almost get that sort of, the sort of the bubble effect of social media, kind of get that here, because you're just getting liberal news or whatever. So it is very tied to a political party, and just the way that information is, it's sort of it's this mixture, as we'll talk about, in a few minutes. It's this mixture of, hard news and kind of stuff coming out of Parliament, and then sort of funny stories of things that happen on the street. And as I'll show today, they just randomly reprint, poetry, randomly kind of reprint, international news items and stuff like that, mixed with very kind of local issues, marriage announcements, obituaries, all these things are sort of there. It's this kind of chaos of they're all just kind of thrown in there. And in a lot of ways, I always feel like it's kind of like scrolling through Twitter or social media. There'll be random kind of fashion calling. What are the men wearing these days? What are ladies wearing to the ball? In a way, it's going to look very foreign to a student in 9th grade in 2020 who was born in the well into the 21st century. But once they break that barrier, it's actually like, oh, I get this. This is how we find out about news.
Yeah. Before we flip to the source, I do just want to highlight that element of your biography that you are in a criminology department, because you're a 19th century historian, but you're not in a history department. And one of the things that's kind of like a sub theme on the video series, in all the videos, is just kind of important interdisciplinarity is. and how if we get so focused on just like capital H history, we miss all this like cool stuff around it. So I just wanted to like bring up that kind of cool stuff around your particular biography.
Right. And I mean, I always encourage, like when I have conversations with, with grad students at conferences and and stuff like that, I always encourage them to think about interdisciplinary things, because it's been, I mean, not only was it just good news that I found an academic job, but it's also been incredibly stimulating being in this kind of interdisciplinary environment and working with, geographers and legal experts and stuff like that. It's been an incredibly stimulating experience in my life that has been, invaluable. So yeah, I think there's a lot to be gained from it. And there's a lot that, to plug what we do, like there's a lot that historians can bring to those conversations.
Yeah.
We did a panel at the CHA.
The Canadian Historical Association.
Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. Canadian Historical Association. We did a panel a few years ago of just involving people, historians who are working in other kinds of departments. And this is kind of a universal experience. The one I've had is, people working in media studies departments, people working in, all sorts of in sort of the education, in education departments. And it's been, everyone talks about like the great kind of conversations that come out of that. And it's really fun teaching history. And this is almost kind of reminds me of an experience that, perhaps a secondary school teacher would have. It's really fun teaching history to people who, all those people doing a BA in history, they know that they love history. They can tell you that on the first day. A student doing a BA in criminology might, some of them come up to me and tell me that they're history buffs, but they're doing, one went to criminology because they want to become, criminal lawyers and stuff like that. But a lot sort of approach history warily, like they're not sure they're going to be into it, and they see my class and go like, I don't really like history. But you can find, you can find things that pull them into it, and if you present it in a way that's, maybe a little bit different than what they think history is going to be going into it, it can be a really, it can be a real eye-opener to them, and then they bring things to the table that can be really stimulating for you. So it's great.
Yeah, because I think too, like in undergrad, or I mean maybe not just undergrad, but like you think that to study history is really to maybe like provide a lot of reverence to a set of like a tradition or a set of stories that you might, or like you might just be like, that's not for me. But understanding history in interdisciplinary context, you're like, oh, I'm seeing how it's important to understand these legacies. And it's not about repeating that story. It's about providing context to these things I'm interested in.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah. Okay, so let's get started. So you sent me a newspaper source. I'm going to pull it up right now. And like, I'm just going to be very honest. This is a very, very intimidating source. Would I choose this for a 13-year-old student? I mean, I don't think so, but I think you're going to prove me otherwise.
I'm going to try to prove you. Yeah, I'm going to do this like a high school debate team. I'm going to do this as like, I'm going to show you. No, this is, so it looks very intimidating. And this is, when I talk about this with students, one of the first things I like to do is just talk about the experience of a newspaper, because again, as we spoke about earlier, some students maybe aren't encountering newspapers, but they've probably seen them around, and they kind of get a sense of what a newspaper looks like in 2020, with a lot of images and stuff like that. These look, you say intimidating, like it looks very dry, right? They're about 4 or 5 pages long. It's almost all text. And it looks, it doesn't look like something interesting, but what I think is that when you take a closer look, and again, so many of these are so accessible to us now, because so many have been digitized. You can just Google, go to the the Archives of Ontario website, or the the Toronto Archives, all these the Library and Archives Canada website, all of these, they all have collections of, even the Toronto Public Library has collections of newspapers, just to give you an example. And so they're so accessible now. And so I just wanted to talk a little bit, sort of point out some things that are, so it looks very different and it looks very dry, but you actually find these really interesting things. And what I think the great thing about newspapers, especially, from, I'm going to talk about them from this era, is they're really kind of this newsletter. This is a society that become, mid-19th century Canada or British North America, pre-Confederation. was, you know, an increasingly mobile society. People were living sort of far from whether they were born in Europe or the British Isles or the United States, and they find themselves in Toronto. And it's really kind of this newsletter that's sort of trying to bring this community together with various kinds of news, right? So you get things like, you know, all the advertisements and stuff like that, which aren't just saying like, hey, we're the best shoe store, the way that, like, I don't know, a sports experts ad would say today. They're really kind of saying like, you know, talking about the kind of products they have on offer. Oftentimes they sort of play up like, we have things from the old country. So if you are, you know, a new arrival in Toronto, we can get you the kind of products that you're used to. There's all this stuff about lots of there's always lots of ads for, you know, private schools and tutors and stuff like that, you know, that will make your kids turn out to be fine young gentlemen, as the ad says right there. Really kind of, really kind of interesting. You know, you learn a lot just by looking at the ads and the way they kind of pitch products, right? In a very different, in this very sort of verbose way that we don't see, you know, now ads are mostly based on images, you know, great things they have, but it's always sort of, they're always, the ads here are always sort of presented as letters, like, I am now offering this wonderful honey, and stuff like that, or wonderful ointments. And then a lot of sort of quack medicine, right? A lot of sort of, you know, sort of, things to help people get over ailments. Whether or not they work is another story. So that's one way that's one of the ways that they are sort of bringing people together. Wondered if you, just moving over to sort of the center of the page, the big, the eye-catching thing on this one is and if you go up towards the top, there's this great image from a murder trial that was ongoing at the time, and they were printing it on a daily basis. They were printing updates from this murder trial, and that is the image there is of the. So this is the murder trial of that's Henry Byon, I think his name is, and the woman is Anne Stinson. And they were on trial for murder. They had the husband of the woman in question had been poisoned, and so there's some intrigue there. They appeared to be in a relationship, and the husband was poisoned. And there's this, so it's just the details of a murder trial that's going on in the Niagara, in the Niagara region, but there's great stuff. This is where you start to get some of these interesting details that show that this is a more interesting source than maybe it appears to be at first glance. There's all this great stuff about relationships and love, and you know, what is betrayal, and you know, what does it, you know, how do we have proof that you know, what does it mean that this woman betrayed her husband? There's some great kind of language about that shows so much about how people were thinking about gender roles during this period. I pulled up some quotes of one of them is just considering whether this woman, you know, is Anne Stinson implicated in this? And one of the quotes is, "The barbarity is such that we can scarcely believe it to be in the breast of any woman to commit such a crime." They contain there's excerpts from the love letters they were writing to each other while Henry Byon was in prison. He was writing letters back to Anne while they were awaiting trial. One of them says. He's trying to convince Anne Stinson to come down and help bail him out of jail, and he says, "Oh, my jewel, don't leave a stone unturned to get me out." And so there's all this. So there's all this great stuff about, you know, that leads to these sort of bigger questions, bigger sort of philosophical questions, like what impact does this kind of crime have on a community, on the children involved in this, and so you know. We do the same thing today, right? I talk about this in the sort of history of crime courses I teach, that we're fascinated by stories about crime. We're hooked on them. You know, we all, you know, look at you know, what sort of shows are on Netflix and stuff like that. We're clearly we love these stories about crime and about violence and about danger and about vengeance, right? And they're doing the same thing here. They're telling these stories as a way of sort of setting out their values. They also do that. You can see a little bit to the left of the image. They also just reprint like romantic poetry on the front page of the paper. Poets today would love this, right? If we would do the front cover of the Toronto Star was just a romantic poem, but clearly there's a reason for this, right? They're working out, you know, they're working out their values. One of these is, you know, one of these poems there's two poems. One is called the It's kind of the heart's first dream of love, and one is called I Will Love Her Still, and it's just about, you know, living up to our marriage vows and stuff like that. It's really interesting, really kind of you know, interesting stuff that is you know, communicating about values. And I think the media today does the same. And this is where I, you know, started thinking about reading between the lines. This is you know, the media does the same. You know, if you know, maybe a high school student might be more familiar with, you know, getting news from, you know, social media or stuff like that, or even their TV news or 24-hour news channels, and, you know, you're getting the sort of the news of the day. But there's also this talk, you know, even if you're talking about politics or talking about you know, you know, the pandemic and the lockdowns and stuff like that, there's these messages going on underneath about community and about, you know, solidarity and all these things, right? So there's deeper messages about values that are going on beneath the surface of just the story itself.
So can I just briefly interrupt you for a second, because first I do just want to like highlight that some of the things you're talking about, it does make me think of things that I see on my social media account, although I'm certainly not a 13-year-old student, but like this kind of blend of like, you know, aspirational images, right? Which I think about poetry, but also like current events and kind of salacious news. So like the murder trial, the fact that ads come up, even though I'm not looking to buy another pair of glasses anymore. I mean, whatever.
You're still seeing the ads.
Like there's ads there too, you know, so you know, like I like that kind of connection between social media, but of course, like, you know, just to flag, not to you, but like, of course, to teachers, that your students' social media accounts will look different than your own. So to like, you can say, like, if I was teaching a grade 8 class, I could say, this looks like my social media for these. How does it look like yours or not look like yours?
Yeah, that's fascinating.
Before you go on, can you just like take a quick step back and just tell us a little bit about the source? Like, tell us about the British Colonist. Tell us about like the year. You said that it's published every day. Was it published in the morning and at night, or just once a day? Could you just like tell us those like brief details before we get into some more salacious stuff?
Absolutely, yeah. No, that's a really good point. The British Colonist was a newspaper that was published in Toronto from about 1843 until 1858. So it goes out of business fairly quickly. And this is one of the ways in which, and you see there, you know, newspapers always had this kind of insignia here. So you see like the beaver and of course the rose. There's a big message going on here, right? That again, that students today might not recognize, but the British Colonist is clearly appealing to the huge number of people people who were migrating from the British Isles to Canada during this period. So this is a huge kind of spike in migration as people are becoming more mobile around the world. Canada's population grows quite quickly in this period. It's being driven by, I mean, there's migrants coming from all over the place, but the big, you know, the dominant group was these British migrants coming over from England during this period. And this was a period, is 1846. So where the Irish famine has just started, and there's some news items in there. So that's a big issue. But there is, and this is an era of sort of really intense sectarian conflict. So conflict between Protestants and Catholics in Toronto, in a lot of places, but Toronto among them. There were quite serious outbreaks of collective violence, of rioting, and street brawls and stuff like that in between Protestants and Catholics during this period. The Catholics would have been predominantly migrants from Ireland during this period. So there was sort of an Irish-British conflict. And so by calling themselves the British Colonist, right, and that ties it into the whole colonial kind of project as well, which we'll talk about later on. They're really in subtle ways and showing the English, the symbol of the English rose and stuff like that, connected with the beaver, which is the symbol of Canada. They're really kind of setting up. They are targeting a specific audience, and so this was meant to be something that would bring that British and largely Protestant community in Toronto together, that they would be sharing this information. And also, I mean, you have to think of it, if you were a an Irish Catholic and you encountered this newspaper, you knew that this was sort of not for you as well. Like this is clearly kind of a speaking to one segment of the population.
And so
that's where it comes from.
But like from what you had said before, this structure of newspaper is very familiar during this time. So even if one doesn't read the British Colonist, am I correct in thinking that a lot of these attributes that we're talking about could be found in other newspapers?
Absolutely. And so there would have been newspapers that looked very much like this for other segments of the community, right? There would have been newspapers for for example, for the people in the Irish Catholic community. There would have been by the time you get a little bit later into the 19th century, there's newspapers that are specifically targeting the Black community in Toronto and more broadly in Ontario. So this was very much, and this is sort of different from now. A city like Toronto will have a few newspapers that are just sort of for the whole city. Whereas again, part of this was these newspapers were really directed towards specific segments of the population. So you would start, a newspaper for, Irish migrants, or you would start a newspaper for Black people who might have been coming up from the United States during this period. So there was on the one hand, they were very partisan and very sort of directed to a single audience, but you're right. On the other hand, there was this kind of shared language of like, this is how people came to understand the world through these types of, through this structure of the newspaper.
And this Mr. James Brown Jr., is this the godfather of soul?
It is, yeah. So he got his start selling periodicals. You won't hear this if you read sort of the normal stuff. They really focus on Live at the Apollo, but he was selling periodicals in Toronto for years before he ever did that.
No, it's important to remember the very long history that he had.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's go back to like what you read from this source. Like I loved the poetry, the murder trial, the advertisements right here, right at the front. What are some other things that you as a historian read from a source like this that seems very overwhelming, but you're certainly breaking it down pretty well?
Yeah, so if you go onto the sort of second and third page, you'll see a lot more sort of typically, if you see the first page almost seemed to be sort of a, slice of life kind of, news items. The murder trial. There's some other stuff there about, fashions at the ball and stuff like that. On the second and third page, you begin to see more material on that's looking specifically at sort of political affairs. And this is and again, you have to think of who's reading this, right? For the most part, it was being, even though it might have been read by a larger cross-section of people, it was the targeted audience here is sort of men of, relatively elite men, right? That's who a lot of this is aimed at. And so there are people who would have been very engaged in the political process. And it goes into far more, this is kind of before what we think of as kind of political reporting. This is more sort of, very, and this is where in places it does get dry. They'll print out, for example, just the entire body of a piece of legislation, and that can be relatively intimidating to kind of go through. Even for somebody with advanced graduate training in history, it can be relatively dry. But there are some other really neat things here. One of them, which I thought, I think it's what page are we on here?
We're on page two right now.
So I think a little bit. Just to the right, sort of to the bottom right of this page.
Like here?
Right around there.
Okay.
There's a really interesting item, which is a report from the Toronto Lunatic Asylum. So obviously, this is very outdated language, to say the least. But it tells us something. One of the other things going on in a place like Toronto in the middle of the 19th century is there's this huge growth in sort of institution building, right? This is a period where we're seeing the kind of the slow kind of expansion. But it was speeding up during this period of public schooling, for example. So we see these institutions growing. We see, hospitals and stuff growing, and the asylum is one of these important institutions that's growing. And there's some really interesting things about this. So this is the report of the medical superintendent of the temporary lunatic asylum at Toronto. That covers the period from 1843 to 1846, and it just gives a sort of a statistical overview of who their patients are, where they're from, what type of problems they're suffering from, what caused their descent into it, and of course, again, a totally different understanding of some of these issues than somebody would have today. They give some of the reasons for somebody seeking care at this institution as intemperance, which means excessive consumption of usually of alcohol, the loss of kindred, so the loss of a loved one, seduction, injury of head. And so again, a lot of this looks really kind of old-fashioned, for example, but it shows that the people who are reading this and the people who are publishing this paper are thinking about how do we deal with people who are suffering from challenges of this kind, right? And they do it. So much of this is done through statistics, right? We probably wouldn't see something like this in a newspaper today. In fact, I'm 100% certain that you wouldn't see, for example, Cam H printing out reports like this in the Toronto Star. But this is how people are kind of understanding this issue. They're doing it through numbers, which is lots of historians have written about this. This is a very sort of modern thing, right? We're going to make sense of the world by just counting stuff. Here's the numbers. We counted everything. This is the era, for example, where you see the emergence of the census as a way for governments to kind of understand how many people are living in such and such a place, and how can we serve them, and how do we deal with them and stuff like that. So just interesting that they print this whole report. And again, we really see the newspaper then as a valuable place to see how people are making sense of the world around them. And again, this is what people are doing in different ways on social media today, right? They're essentially kind of asking the same question, and this is just the way they're answering those questions, or trying to come up with answers to them during this period. So it's interesting to see this kind of report being reprinted. And they talk, the medical superintendent, there are some sort of blocks of text here where they're talking about, how they're drawing on innovative new ways. And the superintendent talks about how he's recently taken, he's recently visited the United States and visited a number of different hospitals where people are coming up with innovative new ways of dealing with people who are in distress and stuff like that. So again, it shows the way that they're seeing this kind of social responsibility to deal with people who are who are suffering in a variety of ways. It just so happened that this day's report is from the asylum, but I've seen similar things of similar questions being raised of who is in jail during this period, or who is what do schools look like in a statistical kind of sense. So this is an example of how newspapers are teaching people about the world around them, and it can kind of show you get a more nuanced picture of what life was like in the 19th century. Not just for, again, I talked earlier about how the targeted audience here is these sort of elite men, but it also when you start reading between the lines, you go like, oh, this, you start getting ideas of, oh, this is what Toronto in 1846 might have been like for somebody suffering from depression, for example, or somebody suffering from other sort of problems like that, other sort of afflictions, right? So you can start to, by reading it from sort of both sides, you begin to sort of you really get a good sense of what life was like in this city at this time.
So a couple things that I wanted to just highlight. That first, the Toronto Lunatic Asylum was the precursor to CAMH, the Canadian Addiction and Mental Health Association?
Center for Addiction and Mental Health.
That's right. Thank you.
I believe.
And that the location in Toronto on Queen Street has actually been a very a location that has served that purpose for
Yeah.
100+ years, and there is still and you probably already know this, but there's still a wall there that was from the original asylum, or the original permanent asylum, because it's the temporary one, that was built by people that were institutionalized, and that there is critical disability history related to that wall in particular, as well as like public history walking tours and things like that. And so to me, although this wasn't part of the newspaper, I mean, sure, perhaps it is, but like for us to think about those kind of continuities between certain things, because we can look at this and think like, this has nothing to do with our lives, although maybe it's like social media, but then it's like, well, you know, there are remnants of this, and there's certainly remnants of these ideas still in operation. Do you want to say anything to that before I say my next thought about this?
No, I think I just think that is a really great, that's a really great point. And thinking of these things, you know, it's one thing to look at a newspaper in isolation, but, you know, you could even sort of look at these questions, you know, in conjunction with, you know, with other items, right? In conjunction with, you know, people, you know, like, you know, a walking tour of the city, you know, and again, show the sort of the, you know, I just think that this is why I love history, is that like you could you know, you could draw these connections, and it makes you feel more connected to the place that you're from. And again, I'm using a Toronto example here, but you know, most even, you know, medium-sized cities in Ontario would have had newspapers from this period, and you would be able to see the same links between you know, ideas on the pages of a newspaper and actual sort of physical places. And I just think it does such a good job of making, if you know, building the connection between, you know, a 13 or 14-year-old student and the place that they're from, right? I think it can be really rich.
And a lot of times those like smaller places, actually the evidence of those histories in the present are more apparent than they are in big cities, because big cities, we apparently need more condos that are glass. The other thing that I really thought was interesting here, that I wouldn't have thought of unless we had this conversation, is like just the intersection of class, right? Like there's 10 men that are laborers, housework, there's 11 women, seamstress, 2, a gentleman, there's one. And like maybe that intersectional class analysis isn't something you're doing with grade, you know, 8 students, but like I think of when I have taught elements of grade 8 history or grade 7 history, or just the 19th century, and like how I often have taught it like, this is the way society was. And I wasn't really highlighting, this is the way society was actively being built, because there is this new colony that people are really understanding, that is some sort of like new world that they're building. And so like, I guess I'm just trying to say that there's room for us to problematize a little bit more the really purposeful creation of society, and like what people wanted from society during this period. I mean, all periods, but like for me, when I look at these numbers in relation to thinking about class, it's like, how do we want people to behave, especially people that are just laborers, you know, like it's not like you have a big family or big family money to help you if you have mental health issues, or to help you with addiction problems. And so this institutionalization, like, you know, maybe that is a kind of a big idea to bring to some students, but like what I'm hearing from you is that institutionalization helps highlight how society was being crafted during this period, and how things like numbers and quantifying things were ways to show that kind of creation of society.
Exactly. And I think it can be hard for I think it can be hard for sort of students at the high school level, and even sometimes, you know, in, you know, first year university or so, to really kind of wrap their heads around, you know, what historians sometimes call public life, you know, politics and institutions and stuff like that. But I think I've always thought that one kind of one kind of helpful way into that and sort of thinking about that is to, I think sometimes, young people see politics as something really removed from them. It's something that, like, these sort of older men in suits and, hopefully sometimes women as well, but these sort of, middle-aged kind of people are engaged in it. It could sort of seem, difficult to wrap your head around. But I always think of reflecting on it as kind of a project, right? That it's not just, it's not kind of inaccessible, but this is just people trying to wrap their heads around how to tackle problems in our society, and they have biases and all that stuff, and they might have their own variety of different kinds of motivation for doing that, but they're engaged in this whole variety of projects, right? Like they're just trying to sort of come up with solutions to address to address a variety of issues, and that might be a way for people to, especially younger people, to kind of wrap their head around this. Of we know there's problems in our society. How do you go about solving them? Not finite, sometimes very finite resources. How do you go about addressing this issue? So that's what the superintendent of the asylum. That's what he is trying to do. Sort of how do you go about tackling this issue? And that could be you could see that throughout the political process.
Yeah, and like if you were to use this newspaper in your classroom today, mm-hmm. It is actually kind of an interesting way to make ties with, like, what are the projects that help create a society in terms of a society that you want as better? And like, what does better look like during your time? Because right now in our society, there's a lot of numbers that surround us in terms of COVID. Yeah. And we have also seen from like, just stay home, don't come back from March break, to we're going to do social distance education with this many students, and then rotating, like from a very kind of relaxed stay at home type of approach to a very over-planned but maybe not well-planned approach to get people back in school. Like there's an institutionalization there. And so we can also just like highlight the way things like numbers, the way things like institutions, the way these types of projects craft society is just like those ties to the fact that we are surrounded by numbers right now in a way we weren't 7 or 8 months ago.
Yeah. And I think, that is really important, because I think that this whole experience of COVID and the pandemic and all the things that we've been living with, I kind of get the impression that a 14-year-old kid, and of course this might happen to varying degrees, but that a 14-year-old child in today's society, like the idea that they can sort of ignore public policy or that it doesn't relate to their lives has like maybe been thrown out the window in a really significant way, right? Because I'm sure there was a point in high school where I sort of thought that these things had no relevance to my life. But when you're looking at the way that the whole handling of the pandemic has had a really direct impact on their experience, that I think it opens them up to thinking about public policy and thinking about how power works in our society and how political decisions get made. I think they're really going to be able to have those conversations in a way that like me and my peers in 1992 probably wouldn't have, we probably would have sort of shrugged our shoulders a bit. But
yeah, my mom, when I speak to my mother, she'll be like, oh, children these days, like, I don't know what this moment is going to do to them. And I was like, I actually think that this is a moment, especially because of how creative young people use technology in ways that are very politically aware, even if they might not see it in that way, that like that young people, this is going to be a spark of action for the future in a way that we might not have been able to conceptualize without that. And like, I think it's kind of cool to like to be able to draw some of those new elements into our readings of this. But I guess we need to be aware of that, right? Like we need to be aware enough of the politics behind a source like this to help see that. Before we move on to, I was going to say, like, maybe you can talk about one more example really quickly before we do our, we move to the last question, because I think we're already over the time I said we were going to be. I just want
Ah,
to tell you a really like funny story. So
sure.
I have like a tea here. And whenever I've done any of these talks with the primary sources, I really hesitate to drink around the primary sources on my computer screen because it's just like, no liquid in the archives, no liquid in the archives.
Yeah. It doesn't feel right. I
No,
know.
it doesn't. So anyway, I just wanted to highlight that I'd like to take a drink, but I feel like there's so many taboos.
Well, like when I first started
I'm gonna
encountering
do
these
it.
newspapers when I was in undergrad, like I had to go to a special, I had to, ride the metro, the subway out to like this special archive and put on white gloves, and it will never not feel weird to me that I can just sort of like wander over, like sit down on my couch and with my laptop and just sort of do research that used to have to be this this big deal. That's
And typing in white gloves is just a whole new experience.
Exactly. Yeah, that's just it.
Okay, let's show one more example quickly, and then we'll talk about how a source like this helps us challenge our understandings of this period.
Absolutely. So I've got the perfect one. I believe it is down on the. Actually, no, I think it is on this page, just to the left of where we were before.
Okay.
Like 2 columns over, and this is a perfect example of the value you get from kind of reading between the lines of these sources, because it's sort of the political news of the day. And it just so happens that the political news of the day was a debate in the province of Canada's legislature about a piece of proposed legislation that was going to put limits on people's ability to fish with nets. This really arcane. Like, I'm not making the pitch that this is an interesting story, but it's one.
Okay.
It's one that I think you can learn a lot about thinking about the process of colonization. If you go into it with that kind of lens, where you're thinking about all these kind of elite men who were who were reading this.
1 second. First, where is it? Because I'm just seeing something about Mexico and
it's
Texas and the Yucatan.
I'm pointing at it on my screen. You see the sort of image again, the sort of the insignia of the newspaper there.
Yeah.
It's just the column to the right of that. It's right there.
Yes, yeah. I see. Okay.
Yes. So, all right. So this is the sort of an example of the dryness of this newspaper, in the sense that they're just reprinting debates from the legislature. But all these elite men who are reading this newspaper, whether they are politicians or merchants, whatever their background might be, they're really engaged in this project of colonizing land that 50 years, about 50 years earlier was almost entirely inhabited by Indigenous people. And now you have this growing, British/European population moving into these places, moving onto land that was unceded and still belonged to Indigenous people. And they're talking about fish, right? They're talking about this debate over whether to regulate how much fish people can catch. But a few little sentences come out of there that really kind of point to how people were thinking about the land and about natural resources and the exploitation of this land that they had just, stolen from Indigenous people. And just one quote that I thought was really interesting. Thus Canada, with its almost boundless lakes and these lakes abounding with fish, is to be without this necessary dish for 9 months in the year. And talking about how if there's restrictions placed on fishing, that people will find themselves in poverty, that there isn't the money necessary to enforce these laws in the first place. But think of that idea of these men who this paper is being pitched at, these powerful men, thinking about just Canada offering up these boundless resources just there for us to exploit. And I think that they don't come out and talk openly about colonization. If you do a word search for settler colonialism in this newspaper, there nothing's going to come up. It can be, unless you're doing this deeper read of it, it's going to be invisible to you. But you're going to find references every single day in this newspaper to this project of taking over a continent, right? That's what these guys were doing. And you find that if you just start reading between the lines, you start finding, again, every day, this sort of thing of, we have this boundless land. And of course, there's no mention of, the indigenous peoples who at the time would have been, across what is now Southern Ontario. They're talking about Lake Ontario and Lake Erie. They don't talk about, the indigenous people who for generations had been, for millennia had been, harvesting, fish from these areas. It was just, they're invisible, right? They're cast to the margins. And this is just about how much fish should we take from this lake. This is providing a living for people from our community, without mentioning, who's being left out here, and who is being pushed to the margins, and who's being pushed away from this land and onto, reserves where things weren't as bountiful as they would have been, fishing in the harbor in Toronto, or around in other places in Lake Ontario, which were, as they say, abundant with this resource that kept people alive, this form of sustenance, right? So that's the kind of thing that, if you don't go in looking for things like that, you're not going to find it. But it shows the value of reading these sources with keeping those broader kind of contexts in mind.
Yeah, thank you so much for bringing that up, because, kind of like we were saying before, these things, our society is created by a set of decisions, and fishing, I don't really do a lot of fishing. Well, fishing, period.
Yeah.
But fishing, laws or policies, that's not something that I'm really interested in. But what I hear you saying is something that really flags how laws create the society that we have, and how, in particular, they can really cement colonialism.
Yeah.
And laws do that now, right? Laws help create a particular society, but these types of laws have a longer legacy. So in mid-September, when there were Mi'kmaq people in Nova Scotia protesting the fact that they, or wanting to engage in fishing without these official licenses, and there were protests related to that, it is very similar to this legacy of laws that are British and French people are going to come in, they're going to colonize the space, they're going to set laws and policies around how land is going to be used, and First Nations people still are saying no, these are not resources that are owned, these are things that we share, and we should have access to these lands and waters without these rules. You created these rules, Right. So I don't know if you picked up that picked that out because of things that were going on, but I'll put some links to that issue below the video as well, because it is just kind of cool, those parallels.
Yeah. And I mean, one thing that is often comes up in the public debates that we have about the sort of the legacy of colonialism in Canada is the sort of, you really see how sometimes history is missing from those conversations. And I think looking at it, and again, even though it's a source that kind of looks dry, it's a way to show people how deeply woven some of these debates are into the fabric of Canadian society, and that we're hearing that the stories coming out of Nova Scotia in the past week about the fishery, and the Mi'kmaq claims on it, that is part of a much longer conversation about how access to natural resources in Canadian society, that tells us so much about power and about inequality and these things. And so when you begin to dig into it, just by looking at a newspaper from this period briefly, you begin to see how these sort of things took shape, and the way that the absence of people from these, the absence of First Nations people from these reports is a way of making them invisible, and therefore making it seem legitimate that people of European descent came in and took the fish, right? And so I think it is, this is just another example of kind of what history could do. When we really look at these sources, we gain a broader understanding of these things. And I think it brings you, it brings a more nuanced kind of perspective into engaging in debates that are occurring in 2020. You know, somebody, again, a high school student looking at, you know, seeing a brief news report or, you know, a clip on their phone of a protest in Nova Scotia or a conflict in Nova Scotia. Once they begin to think about, you know, once they begin to slowly kind of understand the longer legacies of this, they come at it from a richer perspective.
Yeah, and that's kind of how we started the conversation, by talking about like interdisciplinarity and what happens when you come to history with an interest in other topics and be like, oh, it is foundational to have this historical foundation to understand the dynamics. So
absolutely.
The last question, although again, I've taken more time than I thought I promised you I would take.
That's all right. I could do this all day.
Is how a source like this challenges our understanding of the mid-19th century. And you've highlighted quite a few things, like how it isn't this consistent monolithic society, that there are these newspapers like this that are coming from particular political perspectives for particular types of populations. You highlighted how we can look at particular stories to see things like settler colonialism and the way that the state and the projects, I put state in quotes, not because it isn't the right word, but because it might be a big concept for a teacher to bring to younger students to kind of break that down. But like how a country creates a society through different rules and different accounting practices. Are there any like other elements you wanted to leave this conversation with? Although I definitely want to see what's happening here, because this looks like climate change. Is there anything else you want to leave this conversation with about what we learn about the 19th century from a source like this? Oh, I see what's happening. I thought this was about climate change. But it's not. It's a really cute little graphic about photographic likenesses.
Right. Yes. Yeah. Oh. that is really funny. Yeah. Yeah, it is. And there's one right beside it that'll be good for high school students. It's a job ad. Wanted a smart, active lad. Again, you know, somebody, and you can make the point that you know.
Oh yeah.
Kids there were kids, you know, in 1846 you had to sort of earn your keep, you know. They're looking for you know, probably somebody not that much older than a high school student, you know, the same age. So I think you've really done a great job of pointing to some of the things that I think you get out of newspapers to develop a different understanding. I want to come back to the idea that I think the idea that you started with, that this is because of just the way it looks, this can sort of appear like a really intimidating source to, you know, if you're thinking, how am I going to teach, an 8th grade or 9th grade student about the past, you might think that this is kind of foreboding. But one of the things it does, I think, is, you know, yes, it reveals a lot about how the society worked and how they wrapped their head around different sorts of challenges, how they kind of built community during this period, but it also in so many ways shows us the similarity. And I think that's one thing. I mean, I think that might be a misconception about history, that people who haven't studied that much yet, whether they're high school students, the idea is that, you know, the people who lived in the past is a foreign country, the old expression goes. People who lived in the past are so, you know, they live this fundamentally different kind of experience than we do. But in fact, reading these, I think there is kind of a common humanity, right? They're interested, you know, they're trying to keep up with fashion. They're trying to wrap their head around what to do when people get sick. They're looking for work, right? They've arrived, and it might be a story very similar to the story of the parents of a lot of students who would be looking at this in 2020. they've migrated to this, they were born in, a small village in England, and they've ended up in, after a long journey, they've ended up in Toronto. They're looking for a place to live. They're looking for a job. They're trying to, they're maybe at a certain point when they're a bit more established, they're following politics and they're worked up about them. And there is this kind of common experience that you can go, wow, they might have used different language or seen things from a different perspective, but at the end of the day, they're concerned with a lot of the same things that we're concerned with, and that's almost, I think that's really interesting things can come out of that realization as well. They're looking at obituaries, they're getting news about births and marriages, and this is how a community.
I just want to highlight
together.
With this birth announcement that there's only one person named, and that's a man.
Yeah, it's a man. Yeah, the person the least implicated in this event. It's all about the daughter and the wife are just names. But,
that's okay.
W. Thomas Esquire.
I'll tell you who's the most important person in this birth story.
Yeah, in my experience, it's actually the least important person in this whole equation. But
yeah, no, I love that because. Sure, it does look really intimidating, and it's so much text, and we're not used to this much text. We're used to really high image, but I love the way you have sold very well that this is such a useful source to look at a little bit more closely. And this particular source, like, we have highlighted a few things that people could bring into their classrooms, but using other newspapers to look for those same things, I think is really valuable and a really interesting way to think about, like, what were people's lives back in the past and what similarities and differences do they share with us. So thank you so much, Dan. This was really great. I really appreciated to have this rich discussion about this newspaper that, yes, I would not have spent this much time talking about, but so glad I did.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for having me. It was great. I love talking about these things, and it's great what you're doing. And I think it's really creating a dialogue between people who sort of study history professionally and people who are teaching it to young people. And this is going to get the next generation excited about these ideas, and I think it's just wonderful.
Well, I hope so, and I think that your enthusiasm for these newspapers is really demonstrative of what you can get from it. And I'm just going to volunteer some extra time of yours so that if people did find this interesting, that maybe you could pull out a couple other examples, other newspapers that you have taught with maybe yourself, so that a teacher doesn't have to do through the digging, but highlights the same elements that we've talked about today. So we'll see if people want that.
Yeah, you could do this with so many different eras. You could do, I study the mid-19th century, so I know that, but I also just know because I like to spend some of my spare time just sort of browsing through surfing through these things on the web. Like, there's great, even newspapers from the, from the 1960s and 1970s, which might seem more accessible to students. The same lessons come out, right? And especially, you were mentioning before, people in small towns might be more conscious of the past because it surrounds them more. If you're teaching students in Mississauga or Brampton, even a newspaper from the 1980s from those places, I think would be really eye-opening for the students who are maybe growing up in a place where they don't feel a connection to the distant past in the places where they live, or the streets that they walk. But even looking more recently, I think there's a tremendous amount of to learn just by looking at these sources. So yeah, I would be happy. I'm always happy to share my thoughts on this and to help people find ways to dig these things out.
Yeah, and I think too, asking students to compare a source like this with even a cultural community or religious community newspaper now, about one of the things we didn't talk about in this source, but I know you had flagged it in our earlier conversations, and so I'll highlight for people where that is when I post this, about those transatlantic and those transnational connections, and the births and the deaths and the poetry. And I think people will find that in community newspapers now that do different things than our big newspapers like the Globe and Mail or whatever. So yeah, I think this was really valuable. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was a real pleasure.
We'll talk to you later. Bye.
Bye.